Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. My guest today is Mark Schatzker, and he's just written a new book called The End of Craving, excuse me. And you may know him from a previous book that I absolutely love that I was referred to by the doctors at the True North Health Center, The Dorito Effect. Please welcome to the show. It's great to see you again, Mark.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, so what inspired you to write this book?
Curiosity mainly. The Dorito Effect, really looked at the way food has changed through the lens of flavor and how that's inducing us to eat more. But I wanted to get deeper into how it all works. How is it that, what is it that drives us to eat? And what is it that so perniciously drives so many of us to eat much, much more than we physiologically need to? So it was just, one of those things where you scratch your head and you start to turn over stones and it takes you on a path that leads you to someplace unexpected and very fascinating.
But you've never struggled with your weight from what I understand. Why are you so interested in these topics? Because I really appreciate that you write on them.
Because I love food. I have such an interesting relationship with food. By many standards, I'm kind of food obsessed. I think about it all the time. I talk about eating and recipes, and I feel so fortunate that I have such a great relationship with food. I really don't watch what I eat in the slightest. I've never had to diet. I've never had to in any way, modify my diet. So I'm very fortunate, but I also think the way I am is the way we are supposed to be, and that something's gone wrong. And, eating's important. Nutrition's important. It has a direct impact on our quality of life. And I think we're getting it wrong. And I think we need to get it right.
Yeah. Well, what are cravings? And is there science behind actually being able to curb them?
Yeah, so craving on its most basic level is just the simple desire to eat. This, I think, is most profoundly what has changed about the food, our relationship to food. And that comes from, I come at that from a variety of, a lot of different ways. But I guess I'll start to say this way. We tend to vilify the experience of eating. We think that enjoying food is a dangerous indulgence, that it takes us to a bad place, that we must control it, that it's a passion to be controlled and best avoided. There's that old line, if it tastes good, spit it out. Nothing really captures our suspicion and fear of deliciousness than that line. And I think it's flat out wrong. I think it is absolutely 100% wrong. And we'll talk about all the ways that's wrong. But on the most simple level, when we look at brain scans of people with obesity, they don't enjoy food more. In fact, they enjoy it less. What they suffer from is a craving for food. And this is really important because this is what's changed. There's a stigma that people lose themselves in the pleasures of food, that they don't know moderation, and that's all wrong. They suffer from an unnatural and painful craving to eat more than they need to eat. And that was the central object of the book, was to understand that, why it's happening, how it works, and if there's some way it can be changed.
Is there a link between craving and addiction?
There is. I don't want to overstate it. There's some people who've said that junk food can be more addictive than drugs like heroin and cocaine, and I think that's wrong. I think there are similarities, but I think it's in some ways unfair to the people who struggle with those terrible addictions. Maybe at its most extreme, if you talk about people with severe binge eating disorder, or people with an extremely high BMI, like in the 40s, maybe it starts to become similar. But here's where it is similar. There was two theories on addiction. If we wind the clock back about 10 or 20 years, the first was that addiction was all about getting high, that people used drugs because of the pleasure that drugs brought them. Well, that didn't really make sense, because addicts would say, like, no, once upon a time, drinking or shooting heroin or using cocaine made me feel good, but those days are long gone. And now I just do it to kind of keep the beast at bay. So then there was another competing theory that said that people were addicted to drugs to make the pain of withdrawal go away. But that didn't make sense, because people would be clean for years, maybe 10 years, and then something would snap and they would start to use again. So withdrawal had been long gone. And what we eventually found was that addiction is characterized by craving. Addiction is harmful. It's a harmful activity, and people are seized by an uncontrollable craving to do it. And the scientist who discovered that, his name is Kent Berridge, And he discovered that what we think of as pleasure is in fact two different things, two different parts of our brain, two different neural circuits. One of them runs on dopamine, which is a brain chemical you may have heard of. It's a neurotransmitter. And for a long time, people thought that dopamine was the pleasure chemical, that dopamine was euphoria, bliss, yumminess, all things that felt good, all came down to dopamine. And Kent Berridge discovered through some really interesting experiments that that was in fact not true. What dopamine is the motivation neurotransmitter. Dopamine makes us want things. When things come into our orbit that we desire, that is dopamine in action. We become like a missile tracking system. We track it, we're drawn towards it. But then when we actually consume the food that we're drawn towards, a different neural circuit takes hold. He calls that liking. Different neurotransmitters that stimulate opioid receptors. So it's a different neural circuit. And it's important to know that because that can help us understand our own relationship with food. But interestingly, this really opened up addiction. It made us realize that addiction was characterized by craving. And we find the same thing with disordered eating too, that it is characterized by craving, not by too much enjoyment, but too much craving. So a good example will be that people, maybe they eat when they're not hungry. They feel that they don't have control when they start to eat, that it gets out of control. When we see brain scans of these dopamine-driven desires for food, they can predict obesity. So we'll see that before people have actually put on the weight, which suggests that it isn't just associated with it, but it's actually a cause.
Wow. So you said in the book that addiction is the case of too much wanting, and there's a difference between wanting and liking.
Exactly, and it's and wanting is a tricky thing because when we want something, we think we like it. And this is something addicts tell us, that when they're in the throes of craving, they're absolutely convinced that the thing they crave will quench the desire, will put out this raging fire, and it doesn't. And the same thing is true with food, that people very often find themselves craving something. They think they like it. They swear they love it. It's delicious. It's amazing, but it actually never really pays off. It never delivers the promise that it makes. And this is the kind of rut that so many people have gotten into with food, that they crave it, they want it, but it never truly satisfies them.
I think a diet soda like that, because I was addicted to it, and it really does taste terrible.
It is. It's awful. And yet there's this compulsion. Same thing with potato chips. You'd never really say, if someone said, tell me about the greatest meal you've ever had, would you ever say, oh, it was a bag of chips I had about 7 years ago. I was driving down the highway. Never, never. But what is it when we start to eat those foods, your hand just keeps going back in the bag?
I know what you mean. So could obesity be a disease of craving?
I think it very much is. It's characterized by craving. It's not this stigma that the people with obesity lose themselves in pleasure of it, I think is wrong and unfair.
Yeah. So what's making people gain weight?
So that's a great question. And it's a long, complicated answer, but the most important thing to understand is that we've been telling ourselves that this is something we can control. All of diet culture is predicated on this idea that we can control what we put in our mouths the same way we can control whether you steer your car left or steer it right, whether you put on a red shirt or a blue shirt in the morning. And it's nothing like that. And we should know that because the fact that diets fail. Now, here's the thing about diets. They all work, but then they all fail. And this is why we bounce around from diet to diet. This is why we yo-yo diet. This is why different diets come into fashion, because they become popular. People try them. They think they work, then they don't work. They try something else. So here's what the science tells us is that diets tend to work for about the first 6 to 8 months. So you start to lose the weight. You feel good. Your friends tell you you look great. Everything's going in the right direction. Then you hit a wall. You swear, I'm still dieting. What's going on? The pounds are coming back. What you run into at that point is your brain. And your brain is saying, I don't want you to lose weight. Your brain knows how much you weigh, and it has a desired, what they call a set point in mind. And it works in both directions. Your brain doesn't like it when you lose weight. Your brain also doesn't like it when you gain weight. And I know that sounds shocking, but scientists have done studies. They're called overfeeding studies. They put people in labs and they give them too much food. It is so awful that the first time they did this, they tried it with college, students who are, always short of money, always hungry. They couldn't get them to do it. They had to go to a prison to actually find subjects they could force to eat. Even then, people would drop out of the experiment. They found being forced to eat more food than they needed was absolutely miserable. Their metabolisms kicked up so that they were actually burning more calories than they needed to. And then when the experiment was finally over, they lost the weight. Their bodies shrunk back to this set point. So your brain has a pretty good idea of what it wants to weigh. So we have to ask this question, what changed? Well, it wasn't fat that changed. It wasn't carbs that changed. Those things they precede humans by millions and millions of years. Those nutrients have not changed. What changed is what we see in the brain scans, is that we want to eat more. So we have to ask ourselves this question, what is it about the world that changed? What is it about the food that we eat that made our brains go, I want to eat more food? That is the central question that we need to ask.
Well, we're not designed for this environment and where calories are cheap and readily available. We were designed for an environment of scarcity.
So that's what I disagree with, because I think it's not calories that have changed, because we had lots of calories 50 years ago, but obesity is relatively recent. We see there's different parts of the population that don't suffer from obesity. They have access to calories. The interesting thing about the human diet is, there's this idea that the expensive tissue hypothesis, which is that as our brains got bigger, our stomachs got smaller. So we needed to graduate to a more energy dense food. So this has led people to the belief that we're sort of wired for calories and we're born with this addiction to calories. But in fact, if you think about it, that can't be true, because what made us human was this high calorie diet that gave us time to do other things. So a monkey, for example, will spend 80% of its day or more just trying to feed itself. It's not. A cow will spend almost all of its waking hours just eating. So they are much more in the grip of food than we are. We have this ability to eat a very calorie dense meal and then go, I've had enough. I'm going to go build a structure, tell a myth, maybe make a weapon, do something, the things that made us human. And we're still that way. So the fact that we kind of graduated to this calorie dense diet actually means that we had this inbuilt ability to say, I've had enough. I'm going to stop eating and go do something else. So I think it's undeniable that people with obesity consume more calories than they need. But what's making them do that, I don't think is the mere presence of calories. I think it's something else. And that's what brought me in the book to this concept called nutritive mismatch.
But the idea, though, our ancestors didn't evolve on processed food.
No, they didn't. Exactly. So that's what we have to ask ourselves is, what is it about processed food that has changed? And I don't think it's a simple case of calories, because you can look at, France has a lower rate of obesity. The desserts they eat in France are very calorie dense. And yet they don't seem to have this destructive relationship with them. I visited Northern Italy. We can spend a lot of time talking about Northern Italy. They have a very calorie-rich, indulgent food environment, and they're very, very trim. So I don't think I don't think we emerge from the womb addicted to calories. I think something far more malicious is going on.
But they're not eating the same amount of ultra-processed food as Americans, I'm pretty sure.
You're absolutely right. So that's the question, is what is it about ultra processed foods that has changed? And that's what became kind of the driving sort of hunt of this book, is to figure out what it is in processed food that's changing our brain in such a way that we want to eat.
Well, do you think it has anything to do with the fact that it's not only often high calorie, but very low in nutrients? No fiber, for example?
That's an interesting question. It's actually not as low in nutrients as we think. If it were, so I talk about this epidemic of pellagra in the book. This happened a little over a century ago, both in northern Italy and in the southern US. And in the southern US, it was pretty interesting. So what that would start with were these skin scales. It would be like just a single little scale on your hand or something, and then they would spread. People would become sort of disoriented, confused. They would have terrible diarrhea, and eventually they would die. The diet that was causing this was an incredibly calorie-dense diet of cornmeal, pork fat, and molasses. So carbs, sugar, and fat, a really, really calorie-dense meal. And yet these people were starving on that. And that's because it was deficient in the vitamin niacin. And because of that, that caused us to fortify our foods. The government does, it's called enrichment, but this is the fortification of empty carbs with nutrients, with vitamins, which really makes them less empty. So very interestingly, Italy did not do this. They took a very different approach. to the epidemic of pellagra, we saw food as the cause, and we believed our appetites were imperfect and essentially stupid. We don't know what's good for us. Let's step in and start changing food. Italy saw food as a cure. They saw it rightly as being caused by poverty. These people couldn't afford to eat anything more than corn mush with pork fat. So they encouraged people to grow rabbits. They encouraged them to drink wine, which sounds nuts, but the wine back then was unfiltered and had a lot of niacin in it. They didn't know that. They just felt that there was something wholesome about the actual foods that nature produces. And interestingly, Italy also conquered pellagra. It took them a bit longer, but they literally ate their way out of a nutritional deficiency, an epidemic. Well, fast forward the clock 100 years, and the two areas could not be more dissimilar. The American South graduated from one nutritional disaster to another. It is now went from the pellagra belt to the obesity belt. It's also called the diabetes belt. Northern Italy, this is a food Shangri-La. They are obsessed with food. They have more food festivals than you can imagine, outdoor public parties where people get together simply to celebrate food. They have laws about the quality of food and labeling, such that if you call something a San Marzano tomato or you call it Parmigiano cheese and you cheat, you can pay fines into the tens of thousands of euros. In the city of Bologna, the Chamber of Commerce has a repository of official recipes saying, this is how you must make this food. They so revere pasta that they have a noodle cast in gold. So this is a food culture that essentially celebrates the two nutrients we've been fighting a war against, carbs and fat. They turn it into high art. The rate of obesity in the United States, according to CDC, the latest figures is 42%. In Northern Italy, it's 8%. There's a lot of very delicious calories in those people's food environment. They're not in this enthralled to them the way we are. So that tells us we're getting something about our relationship with food very wrong.
So we need to move to Italy if we want to.
Yeah, exactly.
you tell me, I listened to the book on Audible twice and I took some notes. Did I hear you said that Jews and divorcees didn't get pellagra?
Yeah. So this had to do. So what was interesting about pellagra is it's really reminiscent of our obesity situation, in that we've got all these experts who all have the answer, and they all say the other guy's wrong. They pound their fists on the table. So pellagra, they had no idea. They didn't even know what vitamins were. Some people thought it was spores that got into your skin and burst your bloodstream and burst into flame. Some people thought it was caused by flies. Is it a mosquito? Is it a sandfly? And they did what we call observational research. And they found all these strange things, that people who lived really close to a river didn't get it. People who lived far away from a river didn't get it, but people who lived sort of in the Goldilocks zone got it. Jews didn't get pellagra. Divorcees never got pellagra. These are just the funny associations that crop up when you do observational research. And these were just statistical figments, but because they didn't know, they seized on them as causes, which is, sometimes we do things like that. And it wasn't until they really discovered the true nature of the disease that they realized, that these were that's just happens when you look too hard, you see things, that associations that are not cause, they're just associated.
And I just wondered about that. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to ask you. You talk about Italy, but the pasta they're eating is fresh. They probably just made it, and the olive oil was probably fresh. But here, our pasta is, SpaghettiOs in a can. So the sensory properties of food has changed.
Yeah. And it's not just the fact that it's canned. There's so much that we have done to food. It started when we, I would say this attitude of changing food, it really stems from an idea that there's something wrong with food, that what nature gives us is imperfect and we need to fix it. So it started when we basically made it a law that you had to add B vitamins to flour, but we've been doing all sorts of things, artificial sweeteners, modified starches, fat replacers. That's a huge family of additives that no one has any idea about. And this is all predicated on the idea that the appetite is dumb. It's this kind of hungry ogre from the Stone Age that we know better. And what we're finding is that the brain is far more intelligent about eating than we ever imagined. It's controlled by a very old part of our brain that you don't have conscious access to. It does its own thinking. We have no control over our urges. If you like oranges or dislike oranges, you don't have a choice in the matter. It's just how you are. And that part of our brain is like a meticulous accountant. It keeps track of everything coming in, and it keeps track of all the calories we burn. And that's important because the whole idea of trying to fool our brain with things like artificial sweeteners or fat replacers is predicated on this idea that my brain's a moron and I'm going to fool it because it wants all these calories, and I'm just going to pull the old switcheroo, give it something that tastes like it's got calories and doesn't. But then you have to ask the question, what if the brain's actually smarter than that? What if it actually takes a reading as the food's coming in? That's when you taste food and smell it. And what if it does what's called a post-ingestive analysis? And your brain is doing this all the time. It's constantly analyzing the meal that it got. That's why we learn to like things that are sweet or fatty, or we like fruits and so forth, because our brain does this post-ingestive learning, and it sort of marries up the experience of eating, the flavor and taste, with the nutrients that it analyzes later. That's how we come to develop a palate. Well, this whole idea that we can create taste sensations that are uncoupled from nutrition is very, very new. This technology is only a handful of decades old. And what this does is it creates what psychologists call a state of uncertainty, reward uncertainty. Another term for it is reward prediction error. It sounds really complex, but what it means is your brain thought it was getting something that it didn't get. And so if you take the example of artificial sweeteners or fat replacers, it thinks it's getting calories. It tastes like it's got calories. It's either sweet or it's rich and creamy. For all of human evolution, something that tasted sweet had calories. If it was more sweet, it had more calories. If it was rich and creamy, it had calories. The richer and creamier, the more that it had. Now we've created a situation where that might not be true, where you might consume something sweet and your brain goes, yeah, I thought I was getting calories. Turns out I didn't get that. So you have to ask the question, how does the brain respond when that happens with what's called reward prediction error? And what it causes is motivation. It makes us want to get the thing we didn't get. Now that might sound weird. You're like, why would that happen? But we can think of intuitive examples of how uncertainty elevates our motivation. Do you drive a car?
Sure.
Okay, so if I told you the gas gauge in your car doesn't work, tank might be full, might be empty, what might you do?
Fill it up with gas.
Right, you don't want to run out of gas, right? You'd probably be kind of a little bit panicked, right? Because you start to eat away, you think like, I think I got gas in the tank, but if I'm wrong and I run out of gas on the interstate, that's a disaster. You've got to call a tow truck, you're going to be late. Well, that's how your brain thinks about calories. Calories are important. I certainly would never say they're not important. And it's when they become uncertain and your brain can no longer predict what it's getting, that ramps up the motivation to eat.
Wow. So here's a question from a live viewer named Mandy. She says, he said our brain decides how much we weigh. How do I know what my brain wants me to weigh when weight loss becomes too difficult without either extreme calorie restriction or exercise?
Yeah, that's a good example. And that's it's if you're going on a diet and you're finding that it's difficult, you're running into the fact that your brain is pushing back. As to figuring out exactly, what's that number? I know in my case, I know what I weigh, and I'm one of those very lucky people. I eat whatever I want. I don't really need to think about it. As far as people who are in a constant state of restriction or constantly dieting, that's a harder question to answer.
Yeah. You mentioned in your book, I thought was really interesting about that when they put the calorie content on restaurant food, it didn't have the desired result.
No, and this again tells us we think we have what's called executive control over this stuff. We don't. So there's interesting studies where they'll show the calorie counts. They'll have two different groups. One group sees it, one group doesn't. And what happens is in the moment, the group that sees the calorie count will eat less. It'll kind of make them pause and think, oh, do I really want to eat all that much? But then unconsciously they go home, they snack, they have a bigger dinner, maybe they have a glass of juice or a beer or something, and they tend to catch up. So you can't really fool yourself in that way. If we think of something like the nutritional info panels that we have on packaged foods, they display the calories. Well, we've all got really concerned about calories. So we'll start to compare. We'll look at two similar products and we look at the nutritional info panel and say, oh, look, this one's got 50 calories more. It's bad. Well, what we do every time you make that decision, you're incentivizing a company to use some kind of technological additive that will lower the calorie count, like an artificial sweetener or a fat replacer, something that that makes them, have a lower number. So that could really be backfire. This whole idea that we can control it and we can count the calories could actually be causing the very problem that it is meant to solve.
Yeah. Anne, who's watching live, says, what about the 20% of ingredients that aren't listed in products? Is that allowed? They can not have to list everything that's on the label?
My understanding is they do, but that also gets interesting. I mentioned fat replacers, and one of the reasons, the fat replacer industry has been very, very different than the artificial sweetener industry in that they keep their heads down. So artificial sweeteners, we very often see it kind of proudly displayed what it's got. They have brand names. Fat replacers, they have brand names too, but we've never heard of them. These brand names are used in the food industry. So one of them is called Lycodex. One of them is called Simpless. One of them is called Keltrol. You'll never see this. You've never heard of this unless you work in food manufacturing, and you'll never see that on an ingredient label. The one called Simpless, this is an interesting story. It was actually invented here in Canada, or discovered, I should say, where I am. When a scientist working for a beer company, he tried to turn whey into a gelatin. So whey is the liquid that's left over when you make cheese. You have the curd, which is the cheese, becomes the cheese, and you have this liquid stuff called whey, which is high in protein. He tried to turn it into a gelatin, and what he was left with was a kind of styrofoam-like product that crumbled, but it had this fatty taste like cream cheese or cheesecake. So that eventually came on the market called Simpless. It was added to things like margarine. So it would, like a tablespoon of margarine would go from something like 30 calories down to about 6. A coffee creamer would go from 30 calories down to 20. And what was happening is this was all the result of something called a microparticulated protein, which is a tiny, tiny little ball of protein, which gives the mouth the sensation of fat. It sort of dances on your tongue receptors the same way a fat molecule does, a particle of fat does. And, but here's the interesting thing. On an ingredient label, you don't see the word Simpless, you don't see the word microparticulated protein, you see milk protein, maybe whey protein. So that makes it sound far less technological. It kind of sounds wholesome, something came off the farm. There's one, a fat replacer for muffins called Cream Fiber 7000. And that turns up on the ingredient panel as citrus fiber, which to me sounds healthy, like it's probably got roughage, is probably good for my intestine. So that that's a good example of where you can't really find out exactly what's in there by looking at the ingredient panel, unless I study this stuff and I can't even tell.
So the best food is probably the one with no label.
That's right. Exactly.
Is Simpless the same as that Olestra product?
No, Olestra's gone now, but that was, so it's interesting. Fat is a really hard substance to imitate because all the things like sugar has its own taste receptor. That's not how we sense fat. We sense fat with our touch receptor. So you have to find something that can imitate all the feeling qualities that fat has, the slickness, the richness. Olestra was a fat-like compound that the body didn't recognize. So you could cook with it. It tasted exactly like fat. There was no bitter aftertaste. But the problem was that it would kind of mess up our digestion, and people had all sorts of, let's just say digestive issues I won't mention on air.
Like, can I say anal leakage?
Yeah, anal leakage, exactly. So it was kind of, laughed off the stage. So Olestra's gone, but there's a whole bunch of other ones that were, are kind of just flying below the radar.
Yeah, I just don't want to be eating a food where that's a side effect.
No, I think we don't want to go. Yeah.
I learned so much from your books. They're very well researched. And I just, for the first time, you said touch receptors. Is this something on the tongue? This is new to me.
Yes, we have touch receptors in our mouth. I mean, feel your tongue. There's a touch receptor, and you use the touch receptor to sense fat. So sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami have their own taste receptors, but it's not through the taste receptor that we sense fat. It's actually really complicated because there is a fat receptor, but we don't really know what it does. We think it might be there to sense like rancid fats or something, but we sense the fat content of food through how it feels in the mouth, the richness, the slickness, the mouthfeel.
That's really interesting. So you talked a bit in the book about human beings are career temperature regulators, and you talked about these experiments done with different temperatures of water. Why is that important in the context of what we're discussing?
Because it shows the two things. It shows, so this is research done by a French physiologist and doctor named Michel Cabannac, and he had this epiphany. He was doing research on temperature, and back then, this is the early 60s, the textbook said that water felt hot or cold, as in to say unpleasantly hot or cold, all depending on skin temperature. So skin temperature is pretty close to body temperature, and if water was too high above that, it was painful. If it was too low below that, it was painful. So he just done this experiment where he was immersed in really hot water, and he was like super hot, sweaty, felt like there was steam coming off him. He had to scrub out the bathtub because there was another subject coming to do another experiment on. So he scrubbed it out, and then he turned on the cold water, and he put his hand on it, and it just felt marvelous. He was so hot. This water pouring over his hand was just so incredibly soothing. And he had this kind of epiphany because according to the textbooks, that water was way too cold to feel good, yet it felt good. And what he realized is that what feels good when it comes to temperature isn't whether it's far away from the skin temperature, it's whether our core temperature is elevated or reduced. And it's called homeostasis. The brain is always trying to get the body back to the optimal internal state. And what is so interesting is that what felt good is what brought him back to the optimal internal state. So this makes us realize why we experience pleasure in the first place, because pleasure is the motor that drives us towards what is optimal for the body. That's how it works for temperature. And then he had asked this important question, well, what about food? Why is it that so many of us seem to eat more than we physiologically need to? Now, that wasn't a problem for Michel Cabannac, is he just went through his whole life eating what he needed. His appetites were very much in line with his physiological need, but it seemed that some people that wasn't the case. And of course, this was in the 60s. It's just, the amount of obesity back then was tiny compared to what it is now. It has exploded. And that's why it's so important to understand this, because your brain, as I mentioned, wants you to be a certain weight, and you'll feel pleasure as you move towards that and pain as you move away from that. And what is so important to understand is why this desired weight is shifting. And that's what brings us to this idea of nutritive mismatch and fooling the brain and inciting it to want to eat.
Yeah, what is, for people that have never heard that term, what is nutritive mismatches?
So nutritive mismatch is the phenomenon where the sensed qualities of food, which is to say the way food tastes as it's in your mouth, like sweet, rich, does it taste like strawberry, cherry, where that no longer matches the nutritional payload. So the scientist has done the most interesting work on this. Her name's Dana Small. She did work at Yale. She's at Yale. And she showed that she created drinks that had the same sweetness, but different caloric payload. And what she found is that when you create this mismatch between how it tastes and nutrition inside it, you mess up the way the body doesn't metabolize it properly. So this is important because we tend to vilify sweetness. We think it's this frivolous, arbitrary taste sensation that gets us into trouble. It's actually really important. This is your brain getting an early reading on the food that's coming into the body. It triggers, the release of insulin. It plays an incredibly important role in the way food interacts with our body. And I think that we mess with that at our peril.
Great, thanks. So this is really important because girls are reaching sexual maturity more early than ever before. And you said it happens not when they reach a certain age, but when they reach a certain weight. I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, so this is evidence. Again, it's happening earlier, and it's because, too many of us weigh more than we ought to. And this is evidence the body knows how much it weighs, is the fact that something like that, a physiological change in maturity, can be triggered by a weight. They've discovered recently there's sensors in the bones of rodents that appear to sense how much the rodent weighs. And we think that the same is true for us. We also know that fat gives off hormones. So the amount of fat in your body gives off hormones that your brain registers. So it knows how much fat it's carrying.
That's unbelievable. So Kevin Hall, his experiments, what can we learn from that? And what can we learn from The Biggest Loser?
Well, so yeah, if we remember that reality show, The Biggest Loser, where people were competing to lose the most weight, Kevin Hall analyzed them during the experiment and also after. And this also gives us really good data that the brain is really involved in what's going on. So what he found is that when these contestants lost a great deal of weight, he discovered what's called, or found what's called metabolic adaptation, which is to say that their metabolisms slow down. Now, as someone loses weight, you'll expect the metabolism to slow down because it takes less energy to power and move a smaller body, the same way a small car needs less gas than a big car. But what he found that there was too much, like they were being too lean. And this is metabolic adaptation, that their metabolisms had gone into economy mode. So it's like this shows us the brain was really fighting hard, saying, I really don't want to be this skinny, so much so that I'm gonna go into low economy mode. Then many months after it, he came and I think 14 of the original 16 contestants he looked at, and all but one had gained weight, which is actually expected. But some of them had gained a tremendous amount of weight. Some of them were 20, 30 pounds over. And you'd think, they gave into pleasure again. They just couldn't control themselves. What he found actually is that their bodies were still exercising, they were still dieting, but their bodies were in economy mode. They were actually eating less than before the experiment, but they weighed more because of the fact that their brain was exerting such rigid control over their metabolism.
Nice. So Arlene, who's watching live, says this is fascinating and wonders where the microbiome fits into this conversation.
I think it's something that's evolving, and we're learning the role that the microbiome plays. I think the more we piece together, we know that the brain controls body weight. We know that the brain analyzes the food coming in. Exactly how that works every little step of the way. We're learning, for example, that the vagus nerve in the stomach senses nutrient information and sends that to the brain. We know that there's satiety hormones like GLP-1 and CCK. And I think the more we look into this, we'll find that the microbiome is also doing things as well.
Some of the things you talked about in the book were things like I never heard of, like when you talked about fluoride and tamarind, and when you were talking about people in India.
Yes.
I mean, how would you even know to make this connection or think to research this?
Because that's all from a guy named Howard Moskowitz, and people may have heard of Howard. Malcolm Gladwell told the story of how he invented Prego thick and chunky tomato sauce. Howard is a psychophysicist, so he's somebody who understands how the brain interacts with the physical world, and he worked in industry, and he really created a lot of interesting products. He would essentially divide groups of people up into silos and just see what are the things that they like. And he found with tomato sauce, for example, that there's a lot of people who like a thick and chunky tomato sauce that just weren't getting it. So he essentially invented that, and Prego made lots and lots of money. Howard is one of he discovered that there's some people who like really pulpy orange juice, which most people want to get rid of the pulp, but he said, no, some people actually really like it. But he said that his most interesting, he and we became good friends over the years. He said his most interesting study is kind of long forgotten, sitting in the pages of a journal called Science, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the world. It appeared in I think it was 1976. And he was looking at the way, basically the way we respond to what are called the basic tastes. So that's sweet, sour, bitter, salty. And it was thought that these were hardwired sort of conditions from birth, that you emerge from the womb. We like sweet, we don't like sour, we don't like bitter. You can tolerate a little bit of sour, but we don't really like it. And a lot of research has been done on, Western people like you and me, and found that that's basically the way it goes. But he did want to do some work in India, because he heard that there's people in India who had a predilection for really sour foods. So he did some work on medical students in India, and he found that they were just like people over here. They like sweet, they don't like sour, they don't like bitter. But then he found there's these illiterate laborers in this region called Karnataka, which is in the south of India. And they were known for loving tamarind, which is a fruit we've all heard of. There's sweet tamarind that you get in Thailand, but the tamarind in India can be very sour. It can have almost no sugar in it. And the tamarind that the poor laborers can afford is like the sour of the sour. This was really sour stuff. They would add it to their roti. Sometimes they would just eat it raw. And what he found is that these laborers, their curve of liking for sour looked just like it did for sweet. So A little sour was good, more sour is better, more sour is even better, more, until they hit the so-called bliss point where it's at its very best. And then after that, it gets to be too sour, just the same way sweet tastes good until something becomes cloyingly too sweet. So that shows us that these basic tastes we may come out of the womb a certain way, but they can, the world can modify it, that it's not necessarily destiny. Well, that got me interested. I thought, why would that be? What is it about these people? Is it genetic? I didn't think it was genetic. I thought there might be something about it. So I looked into the conditions in Karnataka, and it's really interesting. Like in the American South, they would have these epidemics of pellagra because they eat what is called roti, which is like it comes from sorghum, which is similar to corn. It's a grain, a carb that is deficient in niacin. So they would kind of subsist on this, and they would get pellagra. Well, it turns out tamarind has a ton of niacin in it. So if you're going to be eating this diet, you're really poor. All you can afford is to eat this sorghum roti. You're really smart to eat tamarind. Well, they don't know that. They just like the way tamarind tastes. But they have an even bigger nutritional problem in Karnataka, which is fluoride. Now, we think of fluoride as the element that's in toothpaste that makes our teeth hard because it has this. It forms a mineral reaction. If you have too much fluoride, it goes too far, and you start to get pitted teeth. But it starts to deform your bones. You get these conditions like bamboo spine. There can be absolutely hideous deformations that take place. And this is a real problem in Karnataka. And scientists have since found that tamarind actually improves people's, when people are kind of under this fluoride bombardment, tamarind is a therapy. So they would do tests on dogs, and they would give dogs a high fluoride diet and also give half of them tamarind. The ones that had the tamarind would excrete fluoride in their urine. They would have much better bone and metabolic health. They would then do studies with people in orphanages where they were consuming a really poor high fluoride diet. And once again, the tamarind helped. They would go into villages where there's a lot of fluoride in the water, and they would find that the people who consumed tamarind had much lower rates of these bone deformities. So it's interesting. There's this curious population in India that have this love of sour food, of tamarind, and tamarind is just the thing they should be eating. So it's as though their predilections, the food that they like, the food that they want to eat and that they like, has this nutritional benefit. And we see that they live in a different world than we do, and their palate reflects that.
That's really interesting. And so how did he even know to go there to study these people?
He had just heard. He was interested in like a psychophysicist. He's interested in the senses. He'd heard there's this group of people that really like sour. He went and tested them, and he didn't actually take it any further. That he was just interested in that. I then sort of did the research and found out all this interesting stuff about pellagra and about fluoride. And if you're wondering, like, what's their problem with fluoride? The problem is that it's very dry there. So they pump a lot of their water from deep underground, where it's just been sitting for too long and soaking in the minerals. And that's why they have so much fluoride in their water.
Do we have a bliss point for all 5 of the tastes? And is it universal, or is it different cultures have different bliss points?
That's a good question. I think it's probably different for each person, and probably different culturally as well.
Yeah, but do we have
something like salt,
sweet, sour, salty? So we will have a bliss point for all the different tastes.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people really don't like bitter foods. I'm someone, even though I'm a super taster, I do like bitter foods. I like bitter greens, with blue cheese or something like that. I love that. I think that's a wonderful combination. But some people don't. They just don't want to go anywhere near there. So I think the lesson there is that the palate is something that can change and be cultivated. That by exposing yourself to different foods, you can learn to like new foods. And I think that's very important, because it means that we're not necessarily set in our ways, that we can modify our diets. And I think that's important, because so often we try to do it through restraint and control. And I think the only way we can actually make meaningful change is to make us like and enjoy a new diet, because that's the way to get access to your brain is through the pleasure.
How do we find out if we're a super taster?
There's a test you can do. There's a piece of paper you can buy it online. It's got a particular compound that if it tastes bitter to you, it means you're a super taster. That I should say that's a misleading term because it sounds like Superman, like you're this awesome taster. It just means you're more sensitive to particular tastes. In some ways, it can be kind of annoying because it can make certain foods taste bitter to you that other people can enjoy.
Right. One of the things you said in the book is that food tastes good because it alleviates hunger. Well, if that's true, why do so many people keep on eating even in the absence of hunger?
Because of this elevated motivation to eat, that what we see in the brain scans is that we've done something to ourselves to make us want to eat food in excess of our physiological need. And that brings us back to the nutritive mismatch and how we've sort of goaded our brains into wanting more than it needs.
So I'm not a fan of artificial sweeteners or 0-calorie sweeteners or low-calorie sweeteners. One, I think they taste terrible, but two, don't they contribute to this nutritive mismatch, especially when they're mixing now? One of the new things is where they're mixing the lower 0 calories with the real sugar.
Yeah, 100%. And this is what looks the worst in the research is when you mix them. I'm not always sure that diet sodas are contributing to this because they taste so outrageously fake. But a lot of those are kind of the older generation ones. Then they're getting much better at creating these 0-calorie or low-calorie foods and beverages that taste much more authentic. And one way to do that is just to use some artificial sweeteners with sugar. So it might have half the calories, which is still a big, win if you think that's actually going to work. But it's much harder for your brain to sense that it's an imposter.
Nice. Talk about the men. I can't remember the word you used, where they would just eat and eat and eat and eat.
I'm trying to remember.
The masa men.
Oh, yes. So this is also really, really interesting. This whole idea that we are kind of born, we emerge from the womb on some kind of a mission to get fat. Not true. And one of the best pieces of evidence against this is a group of people. They live in Cameroon and Chad, on the shores of Lake Chad. They're called the Masa people. And in this group of people, it is considered amongst men to be a sign of virility, to be fat, to have this buttery layer of fat over your entire body. So young men from the more prosperous families will undertake something called the Guru Wala. And they essentially spend weeks inside of a tent just absolutely stuffing themselves. They can only emerge to go to the bathroom or to milk a cow, to get milk. So they eat just a tremendous amount of sorghum mush and milk and just packing in as much calories as they can. And they gain an astounding amount of weight, 60, 70 pounds. They finally achieve this buttery butterball body that they so crave to have. But the most amazing thing is they can't hold on to it. The researchers come back months later and they find that as much as they want to keep it, the weight just falls away, which again is great evidence that your brain is the master controller. Your brain makes the decisions.
Yeah, that's why you said you hadn't seen it, but I shared with you a documentary I'd seen years ago by the BBC, actually called Why Thin People Can't Get Fat, where they force-fed these college students something like 20,000 calories a day for like a month. And yeah, they temporarily gained weight, but the minute the experiment was over, they went right back to what they weighed.
Yeah, exactly. It's all controlled by a deep, kind of inaccessible part of the brain.
Yeah. Well, what role does dopamine play in this equation?
So that is like I mentioned, that was the neurotransmitter that was long thought to be the pleasure neurotransmitter, but that we now understand is driving desire. And that's what we see in people who struggle with obesity, who struggle with eating. It's dopamine. They don't enjoy food. They want food. And that is similar to what we see in addiction. I don't want to say that it's the same as drug addiction, because drug addiction is so powerful and absolutely devastates people's lives. But it's a similarity that we're seeing.
Well, I'm not a vegan, just ethical vegan, but as long as the animal research exists, I feel like it's okay to talk about it, not in graphic detail. But I found it fascinating that when dopamine was blocked in the rats, they still stuck out their tongue. They wanted to taste it.
Yes. So this is where this research comes from. It's from a scientist. His name is Kent Berridge, and he was a believer that dopamine equaled pleasure, and he initially set out to prove that. So what he did is he used drugs to sort of tamp down the dopamine in these rats' brains. And then he would kind of squirt sugar water in their mouth. And he was sure, if dopamine's pleasure, if you knock down the dopamine, these rats won't have the ability to enjoy the sugar water. So he knocked down the dopamine, fires the sugar water in their mouth, and they make these cute little rat gestures. They lick their paws or they stick their tongue out, and that's a sign of enjoyment. And the rats were enjoying the sugar water. So he scratched his head because that didn't really make sense. Because if dopamine is pleasure and he reduced dopamine, how is it that they're able to enjoy the sugar water? So then he kind of reduced dopamine even more in the rat's brain, and this thing still happened. So then he did something else. He reversed tactics and he elevated the levels of dopamine in the rat's brain. Well, now the rats would gorge on food, just gobble, gobble, gobble. And you think, okay, that works if dopamine's pleasure, but not quite, because the facial expressions the rats were making changed. They were like making what's called a gape, like a yuck gesture, as though they couldn't control. It's like, I can't stop eating, but I don't like the taste of what I'm eating. And it absolutely flummoxed him, what was going on. But interesting data start to float in from the world of humans. There's some drugs that elevate dopamine that are used to treat things like Parkinson's disease. And people who would take these drugs would go on gambling binges. They liked scratch cards. They would binge watch pornography or visit prostitutes or bug their wives for sex. But they would say, I never enjoyed any of the things I was doing. It's like they were being driven to do it. So eventually Kent Berich figured out what was going on, which is that there's two neural circuits. One of them is wanting. That is just a visceral desire. At its most intense, we would call it craving. And that's the one driven by dopamine. There's a whole other neural circuit, liking, which is neurotransmitters that stimulate opioid receptors. They're very different, and they tell us a lot about our experience of food and what drives us to eat.
You talked about, I think it was a young girl that was fed through her stomach and she wasn't doing well until she could taste the food.
It was a young guy. His name's Tom. This is about 100 years ago. And this tells us how important. So we tend to think, we have this strange relationship with food that we think it's all about nutrition, and that the way food tastes, leads us astray. And that, we kind of constantly envision the future where everybody wears like a silver unitard, that food at that point will just be like pills that you pop in your mouth, because we will be that precise about nutrition. And we tend to think that the flavor, this experience of eating, leads us astray. Well, we know now that the incredible network of sensory apparatus that we have, that literally is the experience of eating, the way food smells, the way it tastes, the way it feels, is really important. And one of the ways we know this is the sad story of a young boy named Tom. I think he was 9 years old, and he I don't know how he did this, but he consumed some clam chowder that was so hot that it sealed his throat shut. He could not eat. So what doctors did is they opened up a hole in his stomach, and he could feed himself through that. But when they did this, they would put food in there, and he was doing badly. He was not thriving. They were worried he was going to die. And one day he just blurted out, he said, "Let me taste it first." And he would then start to taste his food and then put it in his stomach. And he did that for the rest of his life. It saved his life. And so for the rest of his life, he would, if he ate food, if he consumed food, he would chew it first and then spit it into this tube that went right into his stomach. And he said if he didn't do that, it's like he didn't eat. He would remain hungry after, and it was like the food would go right through him. And that tells us how important it is to have a rich eating experience. One of the things I notice, it's not very often that I eat fast food, but if I'm stuck in an airport or something and you're just in one of those situations where it happens, what really I marvel at is just the sheer number of calories that I consume in a really short period of time. But it just like, it goes through me. It's just like, it's like over in 7 minutes. You're like, how did that happen? And I think that one of the things that's telling us is that the experience of food is supposed to be rich and engulfing.
So does the brain even care what food tastes like?
Absolutely. It cares a great deal. It's your brain is hell-bent on prediction. It learns from the past what the future is going to be like. And when it doesn't get what it wants, it kind of gets irritated. And that sort of sends it in this elevated state of wanting.
So my favorite part of the book was when you talked about elevator buttons, because I was like, how did he know I do that?
Yeah. So, okay. So remember I mentioned that idea about if your gas gauge didn't work. So another really good example of how uncertainty elevates our motivation is just think about how we use elevators, right? When you walk up to the elevator, it's like that button, it's because we can't see what's going on. the voyage of the elevator is being determined on what's going up on the other floors. Is somebody like they've got luggage, someone's holding the door for their mother-in-law, their kids are screwing it up or something. You don't know. So like you walk up the elevator, the button's illuminated, somebody's already pressed it, but the elevator doesn't show up. What do? You press it again, right? You like jab, jab, jab. You keep pressing the thing because you don't know what's going on. When you get on the elevator and you have knowledge of what's going on, if you're going to the 11th floor, you press the 11th floor. How many times do you press it?
Once. You
press it once because now you know. And when you know, you're not kind of goaded into that uncertainty. Another good example is the walk button at an intersection.
Yeah.
That delivers some kind of a signal, but it doesn't automatically mean walk. It just basically tells the traffic network somebody wants to walk, and it has its own calculation, but it seems to take forever, right? So what do? You just keep hitting the thing over and over and over again. But now think about a light switch. When you walk into a room, do you flick the light switch on 20 different times? No, you just once. It works, right?
So do people eat more when food is unpredictable because they don't know when they're going to get it?
Exactly. When your brain doesn't know what it's getting, it responds just like you do with that button, more and more and more.
That is so interesting. How it
yeah, and it seizes control. This is not something we have control over. It's a feeling that takes hold of us.
Is there a difference between hyperpalatable and hypercraveable?
So this is interesting because a lot of the scientists will say that we live in a hyperpalatable food environment, and they talk about all the, the double cheeseburgers and the stuffed crust pizzas and all this, and those giant milkshakes you can get, and those, you go to like a convenience store and you get like a bucket of sweet tea or something. I don't think these things are hyperpalatable. I think this is a sign that the brain is in an elevated state for craving calories, because these are not what I would consider to be truly delicious foods. These are signs that somebody's in a state of requiring a great deal of calories. So that to me is these foods are hypercraveable. They're not hyperpalatable. Hyperpalatable to me would be something like a peach in the absolute peak of ripeness, when you bite into it and you lose yourself, and the juice is running down your chin, and it just takes you on a journey. That is a truly wonderful food experience.
Yeah. Well, there's a question from a live viewer. So is it better to have predictable food for weight loss? I would imagine if you know you're going to eat.
Absolutely. 100% it is. And that's why I think so many of these kind of tricks and dodges we've come up with are not working. You can't fool your brain. As nice as it would be, we know it's not true.
Since I don't know if it'll be another 6 years before I get to talk to you again, would you mind if I just ask you a couple of questions about this book, which is phenomenal?
Of course.
It actually was recommended to me by Dr. Jennifer Morano, the co-founder of the True North Health Center, where I often work. And it really changed the way I'm not a fan of processed food anyway, but I never knew about this idea of natural flavors until I read your book.
Yeah.
But I think I was a victim of them without knowing. So I'm going to give you an example. I was at a party and there was serving something called a LaCroix soda. And it has no calories, none, zero, right? And it came in a flavor that I've always enjoyed, coconut, and I drank it. And part of me didn't like it. I thought it kind of tasted fake, but I drank another and another and another. And I'm like, I don't understand. There's no sugar. And then I read your book and I understood that at least for some people, these natural flavors, there's something. It's my brain, they're doing something to it.
Well, that's why I called the book The Dorito Effect, because Doritos really tell you the story of how effective flavor technology is. The first ever Doritos were just a salted tortilla chip, like the kind that you dip in salsa or a bean dip. They didn't sell well. It's when they came up with the taco flavoring. They gave the Dorito, did it taste exactly like a taco? No, but it had that zestiness, that meatiness, that savoriness, that these flavor chemicals that when people pop that chip in their mouth, something went off in their brain and their hand goes back in the bag. So the reason this is insidious is because the reason we can sense flavor is because flavor is a cue that takes us to different nutrients. So we know with experiments with animals, if we make them deficient in a nutrient that they need, they will seek out foods that have the nutrient. How? They don't have, nutrient detectors. They don't have a laboratory. They seek out flavors that lead them to the nutrients that they need. And that's why we like flavor. That's why flavor exists. And that's why when we muck around with these things, it comes at a big cost.
Well, I think, if they have the right to do it legally, it's fine, but like they don't have to disclose anything. And I think that's so unfair.
Yeah, so they call these things natural flavors, and people think they see the word natural and they think there's something wholesome about it, that it's like eating an apple or it came from a farm or something. All that a natural flavor means is it's a flavor compound, very often molecularly identical to a so-called artificial flavor. The only thing the natural flavor means is how they made it. So an artificial flavor might be made using a substrate like a petrochemical that they do all sorts of weird chemical things to finally get the chemical they want. A natural flavor, they might distill it. They might find it in a blade of grass and use various different technologies to isolate it, use heat, use a centrifuge. But what they eventually get is the same thing. So I kind of liken it to saying it'd be like if you paddled a canoe to San Francisco versus landed in a helicopter. Would you be in natural San Francisco versus artificial San Francisco? No, you're at the same place. How you got there is irrelevant.
Yeah, do you think that will ever change, that they'll have to disclose it at some point, or will people become more aware of these things? Because I mean, some people probably aren't sensitive to them, but I really try to avoid any food that has natural flavor in it.
No, I think, well, the problem is there's a lot of money at work here, and money talks, and you're aware of it, I'm aware of it, many of your viewers are, but most people aren't. And it's very difficult to enact legislation to do anything about it. So I think the best thing to do is to just raise awareness and try and get people to try and make wiser decisions, to at least have some idea of what's actually in the food that they're eating.
Do they use these in other countries as far as you know?
Absolutely. But I mean, I think it's particularly bad here. We consume an awful lot of processed food.
Right. Mandy says, I'll be listening to his books. I hope he narrates them. You don't, though, and you have a wonderful voice.
I do. Yeah, the problem was I wanted to do this one, but because of COVID, it was just difficult to get into a studio, and they wanted to make it available at the time the book was published. So maybe my next one. Great.
Well, another thing I appreciate so much about your book, and you were so kind to send me the research, about the bitter taste. And
yes,
I mean, what kind of guy? I mean, what a guy, you have a question and he answers you. That was just so helpful to me, what you taught me in that book about the bitter taste, because I have found in my work with people that are trying to lose weight, that there's something about eating bitter greens that just kind of shuts off the hunger switch.
Yeah. And I often say too, if you're someone who doesn't like your vegetables, eat them first, like when you're at your hungriest, and that's how you can learn to like them. I think that's a big part of it. There was also a really interesting moment in this book. I visited a laboratory in Germany where one of the leading researchers on disordered eating, and we did something called hedonic therapy. And she gave me 2 potato chips. It started, and this was really to show the power of wanting, of dopamine. And she wouldn't let me eat the chips. She just let me sort of rub them together to nibble them. And I was absolutely consumed with craving. I mean, it was almost painful. I wanted to eat these stupid chips so badly, but she wouldn't let me. And that really made me realize the profound grip a lot of these foods have, even on people like me who tend not to struggle that much. And then she kind of showed me a food that triggered this other neural circuit. She gave me a little dark chocolate, an exquisite high quality dark chocolate with a biscuit center. And I just let it melt in my mouth. And it took me on a journey. And it was just it was like, I just sat with my eyes closed and listened to that chocolate speak. And what's so interesting is that she has patients with binge eating disorder, and that it can be awful. People are overcome with this desire they'll eat to the point where they're in pain. And when they have this desire to binge, she will say, eat one of these very fine, high quality chocolates. And that can extinguish this desire to binge eat. So I think that shows us again that the way out of this mess is not through restriction and pain and avoiding pleasure, but indulging ourselves in the pleasures of real wholesome food.
That's right. Real food. It comes from outside, not
the land and the sea.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, if this investigative journalist kind of writing doesn't work out for you, I mean, you could be a food writer.
I did a lot of food writing. I did a lot of travel writing. That's what got me interested in this. So,
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I wish you every success with this book. I hope a lot of people will buy it. I'll be posting the link. And also, I just have to give a shout out just because this is such a great book too, even though we want you to get this one, don't ignore this one because they're both excellent. Thank you so much for your
thank you
work.
so much. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's really fascinating. Your books are so well researched and just very interesting. I felt like you were taking me all over the world kind of to weave a story, almost like a movie.
Yeah, it was an interesting journey for me. So it was a real pleasure to share it.
Yeah, it can almost be called the Pellagra Chronicles.
That's right. Exactly.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks,
you too.
Mark.
Thanks
And
again.
thank you. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow when my guest is Asha Gala, and we'll be talking about mindfulness.